Good morning. Today we want to prepare you for your second draft, which is due by Sunday at midnight. So we're going to take a look at some examples. We'll have a few thoughts about structuring a multi-source essay, and then we'll have end with some reminders about the assignment for this second essay. So let's dive right in. A quick review of the kinds of evidence that we talked about in our second unit. So first you have your text. Your text is the thing that you're going to interpret, and for even in a multi-source essay, you want your text to be one thing. So you want to have one main key work or issue that you're focusing in on, and the bits and pieces of that text that you draw out for analysis are your textual evidence. With a multi-source essay, you're bringing in historical evidence potentially, which are things that happen before or roughly contemporaneously with the emergence of your text that influenced the way in which it came into the world. You may also have historical citations. For us, these would be those reference works that you did for your second response paper. These are basically where you're getting your historical evidence from. That's the first kind of citational evidence. The second kind of citational evidence is a theoretical citation. If you're doing some version of a lens essay, these are abstract ideas, concepts, philosophies, theories that help you interpret your text, even if those sources don't talk about your text in particular. Then there's, of course, critical citations, which are interpretations of the same thing that you're interpreting. For the most part, that's Unit 3 material, with one special exception that we'll talk about momentarily. So with those key terms on the table, let's take a look at some examples. The essay that I've sent you, called Vaulting Ambition, starts out with some orientation to the text of Macbeth. And what I'm doing here is I'm setting up a surface reading. Macbeth is about ambition. That orientation, a little bit of evidence, a little bit of analysis, then leads up into a problem statement that comes at the end of that first paragraph. So note that this is a problem statement that is posed with respect to my text, ambition in Macbeth, which is the thing that I'm interpreting. I'm going to go on to bring in additional sources, but this first paragraph of this essay could basically be the first paragraph of a single source essay. Except the way that I'm going to respond to it as we start turning to paragraph 2 is going to, instead of posing a question in the first paragraph, answering it in the second paragraph, proceeding with a single source essay, I'm going to bring in some additional sources to help me respond to that. So you can see the second paragraph starts out with a method statement, which is to say this problem that we identified at the end of the first paragraph we're going to respond to by bringing in Robert Merton and his essay Social Structure and Anomy. That's going to provide us with some terms, some theory, some concepts to help us unpack ambition in Macbeth. So I start out that second paragraph with a method statement, and from Merton I draw the terms that I'm using to unpack Macbeth. With respect to a lens essay, which is what this is an example of, you can see we have a first paragraph that poses a problem, a second, and in this case third paragraph that set up the lens, and then we're going to go on in the fourth paragraph to talk about thesis. But I really like this structure for a lens essay, which is you pose a problem, then you take a little bit of time to give a broad overview of what the lens is, to give a summary of the theory that you're working with. Notice that summary is done almost exclusively in my own words. I'm quoting very, very selectively from Robert Merton because what we care about is Robert Merton's ideas. We're not analyzing the language that Robert Merton used, except in the special case of if I'm drawing my terms from Robert Merton's essay. We wrap up that theoretical overview at the top of page 3, and then we use those terms that we've drawn from Merton to deliver our thesis statement starting in the paragraph that begins in the middle of page 3. In a similar vein, Scottish society, rather than Macbeth's ambition, is the origin of the tragedy that occurs in Shakespeare's play. So truth claim followed up by a little explanation. More specifically, the aspirational aristocracy in the Scottish society depicted by Shakespeare is the origin of Macbeth's ambition, understood as his pursuit of culturally approved goals through illegitimate means, such that Macbeth's ambition looks exactly like Merton's innovation. So you can see how we're using the terms that we set up in our overview of our method, of our lens, to articulate the claim that we make in our thesis statement, which is followed with a little bit of what's at stake. Merton's sociological theory of criminology can help us see how Shakespearean tragedy works on the social level, in addition to the individual level emphasized in Aristotle's theory of tragedy, as discussed at the end of this essay. So that's just indicating to my reader, this is where this is all going to end up. This is what the conclusion is going to be about. In this particular case, I thought it was helpful to start the body of the essay with a counter argument and respond to that, because I know that the argument I'm delivering is potentially controversial, will raise some eyebrows, and that being the case, it seemed wise to kind of dispel some of that skepticism right off the bat. So start of the body, counter, and response coming at the top of page 4. Then, in a Linz essay, we're basically now set up in the body of the essay to work through our evidence chronologically, very much like a Unit 1 close reading, except now we're bringing in those theoretical citations from Robert Merton as we go. So you can see we start out with a little bit of historical context. The historical evidence that I'm drawing from my reference works, I'm summarizing, I'm putting that material in my own words, I'm not quoting that material from reference works, but then you can see the historical evidence is the material about King Malcolm, about the Scottish throne and so forth. That is material that I think is important for understanding what happens with ambition in Shakespeare's Macbeth. So that's my historical evidence that is summarized. The historical citation, which is the place that I'm drawing my historical evidence from, is the David Norbrook and the parenthetical citations to Malcolm II and Duncan and so forth. But you can see through all of this, the logic of the body paragraph that we talked about in our first unit remains. You make a claim, you provide evidence for the claim, you provide analysis of how the evidence supports the claim. The only difference here is that now we're drawing historical evidence as well as textual evidence in that block quotation that you see. Keep in mind, the basic building block of an academic paper is evidence and analysis, Unit 1 style stuff that we've talked about, and all of those ideas about how to handle evidence from Unit 1 still apply here. But then note that when I'm doing the analysis here in my multi-source essay, in this Linz essay down at the bottom of page 4, I'm using the terms that I'm drawing from my theoretical citations, from my Linz, to do the analysis of my textual evidence, because the logic of a Linz essay is that bringing in this abstract idea is going to help us understand what's happening in our text better than if we were to do just a straightforward single source analysis. Top of page 5, we continue with the body of the essay. We have a counter argument, we respond to it, that shifts into the assertion that launches the next section. Again, I'm using the terms from my theoretical citation in order to perform the analysis that I'm doing, but then the basic logic of the body paragraph survives. Make an assertion, provide evidence, provide analysis, and then I proceed through the body of this essay, which we won't look at totally in depth here, but we'll skip forward to the very end of the essay in terms of how do we wrap this up. Very similar to a Unit 1 single source analysis. In this particular case, the final paragraph starts with a counter, gives a response, and then develops some implications. And again, that's a substantive paragraph that we develop the implications with. We kind of build up into a theory working outward from Macbeth of hamartia in tragedy as something that is social in addition to individual. You can see on page 12, the works cited page here, that has the two main texts that I'm dealing with from Shakespeare, Macbeth, and from Merton, Social Structure and Anime, but it also has the reference works that I've drawn from to get my historical context and so forth. Now, it's entirely possible to do a multi-source essay with only two texts, your Shakespearean text and your modern text, but it's also sometimes helpful to bring in those additional reference works to add historical context when needed. So let's jump over to a second example here, this one called Unconscious Complicity in Drama, Television, and Politics, looking at Shakespeare's Richard III and House of Cards, and then with respect to stakes and implications, drawing some connections to the 2016 US presidential election. As you can see, this introduction is much shorter It works a lot like an abstract. If you've seen abstracts on academic research, it kind of just jumps straight into the elements of academic argument, starting out with providing a text statement and a method statement that is wrapped up in one, generating enough orientation as needed to help my reader understand those. So this essay reads the issue of complicity in William Shakespeare's 16th century English history play Richard III in conjunction with the recent Netflix hit House of Cards, which adapts Shakespeare's early modern monarchical politics to a 21st century American setting. Giving just that little bits of orientation, but then also identifying my text, what I'm interpreting, and my method, how I'm interpreting it by reading those two texts together. I shift here into what's at stake in doing so. My goal is to create a vocabulary for understanding the problem of complicity in the campaign and administration of the President of the United States, Donald Trump. So that's what the conclusion of this essay is going to be about. That's where all of this is going. I just try to indicate that to my reader. I then cover a key term, and in this case I cover the first articulation of that term in 1656 from Thomas Blunt. So again, often your terms are more of a discussion than a definition of terms. I use that term then to develop my thesis statement. As argued in this essay, I try to flag it a little bit so that my reader knows where my thesis is, and then going into the stakes. Again, this is what's the conclusion of the essay is going to be about. So with this essay, I want to focus on structure. In your multi-source essays, as much as possible, you want to structure them as a chronological narrative from start to finish. We did this with our single source essays, but things are more complex now because we have more additional text that we're bringing in. But you want to cover each field of evidence in turn in its own section before moving on to the next field of evidence, which might be the next text. So that is to say, with a comparative or a multi-source essay, you really don't want to be jumping back and forth a whole lot between texts. Instead, think about chunking things out into separate sections so that, for example, you cover first the Shakespearean text, and then in another second big section, the Heath, the modern adaptation. You can, when you then do the analysis of the Heath, refer back to the Shakespearean analyses that you did earlier, but you don't want to be introducing new evidence from both texts at one and the same time. It might make sense to us as writers, but to your readers, it's disorienting to get all of that new information at once. So what you can see in the structure of this essay here is that we start out with the historical evidence for Shakespeare's Richard III, a little bit about complicity in the early modern, pre-modern age. That historical evidence, top of page 2, is again summarized. I'm putting that into my own words. I'm paraphrasing what's happening in my reference work that I'm drawing from. I'm not quoting from my reference work. I want to save my quotations for my actual text, Shakespeare's Richard III. But as you can see, even if it's historical evidence, it follows the same logic. Make an assertion, give some historical evidence, provide some analysis of that historical evidence, and then bottom of page 2, the second body section starts out. I've now shifted from Shakespeare's historical context into Shakespeare's Richard III. I've shifted from one field of evidence to another, and again, I think it's best to be able to chunk things out discretely in those different sections, but then follow the same logic. Make an assertion, provide some evidence, provide some analysis. Here again, where I'm quoting on page 3 is from the Shakespearean text itself, and then there's a bunch of analysis that follows that big long block quotation on page 3 and page 4, leading up to page 5. The end of this section elevates up to the level of the argument, and I kind of summarize the argument up to this point, and then shift into a new section where I bring about my new text. In this new section, as noted, you can and should refer back to the analyses established in the previous section, so you can see where I'm in my reading of House of Cards referring back to my reading of Richard III, but I've already done that reading, and so it's really in the sense of orientation, kind of reminding my reader, making connections of analyses that we've already done, as opposed to needing to analyze both Richard III and House of Cards all at once, one and the same time. That second body section ends up, and then as we shift into the conclusion here, you can see there's one paragraph that gives a full, robust overview of my argument statement starting in the middle of page 7, and some unconscious complicity, etc., etc. From that argument statement, then I shift into a full, robust discussion of the implications. The basic logic of this essay is that Shakespeare's Richard III and the modern adaptation House of Cards allow us to develop this concept of unconscious complicity, and so in the conclusion I'm going to take that concept of unconscious complicity and show how it has legs, show how it has value for explaining other things, in this case some recent politics from the 2016 election. So you can see that there's kind of a lens move that's made then in the conclusion, which is to say our analysis developed the concept of unconscious complicity. In the conclusion, we're going to use that concept as a lens through which to look at this additional example here drawn from life rather than literature. I've given you a few additional examples of Shakespearean multi-source essays in your packet. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you can use these to get a sense of some strategies that you can use. The Lydia Goldberg essay gives some really good examples of deep historicism. If you want to situate your work in historical context, you can see she here kind of opens up a discussion about a comparative essay, Shakespeare's Richard III and Ian McKellen's film adaptation, and then historicizes those with the help of reference works. So that might be a good model to work off of if you're dealing in depth with historical context. The Miles McAllister essay, one thing to note is the emphasis on orientation in this essay, because when you're dealing with multiple sources, it's even more important to understand, to make sure that your reader understands the various texts that you're dealing with and where they're coming from. So you can see even in the first sentence here where Miles is providing some orientation about what the second part of Henry VI is, of Shakespeare's first tetralogy of history plays, etc., etc., and how that relates to George R.R. Martin's A Song of Fire and Ice book series, which then formed Game of Thrones, the television show. This is going to be an example of a comparative essay. So we're looking at the same theme as it surfaces in Shakespeare and in Game of Thrones, and then in this case, Miles is going to go on in the conclusion of the essay to indicate how different historical contexts influence this theme to surface in different ways. So in Shakespeare's historical context, the honorable advisor is swallowed up for one reason, and you can read the essay to discover that reason, whereas in the conclusion at the end of the essay, Miles says in a modern context in Game of Thrones, the honorable advisor is swallowed up by the culture for a different reason because of the shifting historical contexts of composition. And Sarah Wetzler's essay, Stigmatization in Richard III, is another good model for a lens essay if you're dealing with Peter Sondy. What we have here is we open up in the first paragraph a problem about Richard III. In the second paragraph, we turn to Erving Goffman's book Stigma. That's going to provide the conceptual lens through which we're going to look at the problem of physical deformity in Richard III. And then from there, Sarah gives her thesis statement, proceeds into the body of the essay, which does analysis of Shakespeare's text, Richard III, by using the concepts and the terms that Goffman provide in his book Stigma. Okay, so a few kind of general thoughts, some ways in which you might structure a comparative essay. To me, it would make sense to start out a comparative essay with what's at stake in this comparison. And again, you might not know that until you've sort of fully worked out your evidence and analysis in the body of the essay, so that might be something you have to write last. But in terms of how your reader best accesses this information, think about providing some orientation to the stakes and then developing a question or problem that's related to that big picture issue of what's at stake. From there, in the second paragraph, you could pivot into the text statement, what you're interpreting, your method statement, how you're interpreting it. Often the text and method statement can be combined into a single sentence. I'm interpreting X by doing Y. Maybe you need to set up some terms, but then you can deliver your thesis statement. And in this case, because you've already identified what's at stake, you can then jump straight into the body of your essay. And here in the body of the essay, again, I strongly encourage you to go as chronologically as possible with each field of evidence chunked out into its own section. So section 1, in this particular case, would be the early modern context, the early modern historical evidence. That's what came first. So let's just tell a story here and cover that first. That would probably be a shorter section because the historical evidence isn't as important to us as the textual evidence. So in a section 2, which would be a longer section, you cover that Shakespearean text, what's called in the diagram example 1. Okay, that's the second step in our chronological narrative. The third step then is to go back to the modern history to update us on what has happened, what has changed between Shakespeare's time and the time of the adaptation. So again, another shorter section dealing now with the modern historical evidence. And then maybe fourth, a longer section again dealing with the modern adaptation. That's again textual evidence, so you want to spend a little bit more time there. And then the conclusion, is fairly standard Unit 1 style stuff. You have your argument paragraph. If you need a full summary of the argument, then you can deliver that there, or maybe you've been giving bits and pieces of the argument as you've been working through the body of the essay and you don't need that full summary. But in any event, you can then shift over into the implication paragraph or paragraphs, and you want to develop that into a full, robust point that is made in the conclusion. If you're doing a historicist essay, I think you take a different organizational approach. So here I would start the essay by opening up a question or problem about the text that you're dealing with. So this would probably be the Heath. So without referring to King Lear, open up a question or problem about the Heath that you can then, in the next paragraph, which is the thesis paragraph, pivot to text statement, method statement, basically making the point that what we're going to do is respond to this problem in the Heath by bringing in this additional source, Shakespeare's King Lear. Again, the logic of any multi-source essay is that we can get a better understanding of the issue at hand by bringing in these additional sources than if we were to do a single source analysis of the essay. But in the introduction of a historicist essay, you can still very much pose the question or problem that you're responding to with reference to that one source itself. Then you could shift into the body of the essay, and section 1 would be the context, which here's the Shakespearean historical evidence. That would be a little bit shorter. That would set up your close readings of the text itself, the Heath, and that's textual evidence. You would spend a little bit more time working through that text because that's the text that you really care about. Your idea is that we can better understand that text by bringing in this additional text, Shakespeare's King Lear, and then again, conclusion, standard arrangement there. If you're working with Peter Sondy, then you're probably doing a lens essay. The idea here is that Shakespeare's King Lear can be better understood by bringing in this theoretical source, Peter Sondy and the philosophy of the tragic. Again, if that's the case, then start with King Lear with a question or problem paragraph where you open up a question with respect to King Lear itself. Then in a second paragraph, what I call the lens paragraph here, you can shift over and say we can respond to this problem with a text method statement by turning to the philosophy of the tragic as articulated by Peter Sondy. And you can give a overview of the philosophy of the tragic, as in earlier examples we gave an overview of Robert Merton or an overview of Erving Goffman. That's probably where you're going to draw the terms of your conversation from, and that's going to set you up for a thesis paragraph in which you can use those terms to make a claim about the problem that you identified in the first paragraph. Then into the body of the essay, body sections working chronologically through your idea, your text as clear as possible. The only difference here is that now your textual evidence is, your analysis of that evidence is aided by theoretical citations that you can make back to the Peter Sondy material that you set up in the introduction, working forward to conclusion, again, argument, implications. If you find yourself doing a test of theory essay, then I think the best way to approach this is to start with Peter Sondy, give an overview of Peter Sondy's theory of the tragic, and you want to be generous and substantive in your summary of that idea, because then what you're going to do in your thesis paragraph is basically pivot to saying, looking at King Lear either confirms or disconfirms this theory of the tragic. Most of the time, if you're doing a test of theory essay, it's because you find the theory is not satisfactory. And so what you would want to do is to propose a different theory of the tragic that more fully accounts for King Lear. Why does King Lear force us to modify Peter Sondy's theory of the tragic? And then in the body sections of your essay, you would work through the Peter Sondy theory, talking about how it does or does not account for King Lear. And then in your argument, you could summarize your claim about whether it does or does not account for King Lear. And then the key point would be the implications paragraph, where if you find that Peter Sondy's theory is wanting, you can develop a new theory of the tragic that more fully accounts for the evidence we have before us, most especially King Lear. Okay, so a few thoughts about the distinction we made between close reading and theorization in Unit 1. If you're doing a close reading, then bringing in Shakespeare's King Lear will help us understand something about the Heath that we wouldn't recognize via a single source analysis of the Heath. The slide needs to be updated from last semester, obviously. If you're doing a theorization, then your analysis of some similarity or difference between King Lear and the Heath can be leveraged to reveal something about some issue beyond these texts. It could be the identification of a literary trope, probably tragedy, or the representation of madness, something like that. It could be the recognition of some historical phenomenon, the way that madness was represented in Shakespeare's time versus the way it's represented in our time. It could be the elucidation of some ongoing social phenomenon, as we saw with the case of the 2016 election in the Richard III and House of Cards essay. All of that has to do with what's at stake. That's kind of what you're going to talk about in the conclusion of the essay. So I want to wrap things up here with a number of slides that kind of run through some reminders to keep in mind as you go about writing your draft. So first of all, think carefully about your textual evidence versus your contextual evidence. Your text isn't all of your main sources. You're likely to have a target text, which is the thing that you're trying to interpret, and then some helper texts which aid your interpretation, but they're not really the point of this. So for example, if you're doing a historicist essay on the Heath, what you care about is the Heath. King Lear is less important to that essay than King Lear being a helper text that makes you able to understand certain things about the Heath. So just ask yourself, what is the thing that you're interpreting in this essay? What is your text? Remember that when you're writing a text statement, you want to articulate both the material thing that you're interpreting, Shakespeare's Macbeth, and the conceptual thing that you're interpreting, the root cause of crime in Shakespeare's Macbeth. So it might be helpful to write out a text statement so that you're clear in your mind what it is that you're actually interpreting in this essay. Multi-source essays always raise the issue of audience. Don't try to be all things to all people. Instead, write to a specific academic audience, and remember, academics are concerned with a specialization. So for a multi-source essay to be successful, it's crucial that you figure out the area of academic inquiry you're making a contribution to. We talked about this in our first unit a little bit, but you want to really figure out, am I writing to literary scholars or am I writing to psychologists? And the thing to keep in mind is that you won't really know who your audience is until you know what your implications are, because your audience is the academic audience that cares about what you talk about in your implications. So with respect to the stakes and implications of your essay, ask yourself, what's the payoff of your argument for a distinct academic question, field, discipline, so forth. As we talked about in our first unit, you want to try to remain analytical, describing what is true, what something is, how it works, and not lapse into the ethical or the political prescribing what we should do to make the world a better place. That remains true if, for example, in the essay about Richard III, House of Cards, and the 2016 election, I'm talking about political things in my conclusion, but I'm not being political. I'm analyzing politics. As long as you remain in an analytical register, I think you're free to talk about whatever you want. But it's when you lapse into, telling people how to live their lives, telling people what we should do, that you lapse from the analytical into the ethical or political. So some strategies for conclusions. You don't want to do all or even more than one of these. What you want to do is pick a single approach and pursue it to its full extent. So are there common misconceptions that your argument challenges in the field that you're working in? What are the lingering questions that need further thought or research? Have you been able to theorize outward from your evidence to create a model for evidence you haven't analyzed in depth? The example of unconscious complicity in the Richard III and House of Cards essay would be an example of that. Can you offer a concluding example that kind of brings it home in a concrete way? So go back to your text and solidify things in a specific close reading. Is there another turn of the screw in your argument that might surprise your reader? And just as you can't know who your audience is until you know what your implications are, you can't know what your implications are until you know what your argument is. So some thoughts about your argument. Remember our strategies for developing your argument from Unit 1. First, response paper 1.1, identify what your driving question or problem is. Second, create a timeline of the evidence that you're working with. Identify and explicate the most important passage for your question. Do a conceptual map, write an argument statement. Working off that argument, write a thesis statement. We did that in response paper 1.3, and then also in 1.3 we created a basic one-page outline for your essay. So those are some of the steps that you might go through. The same steps apply, even though now we're dealing with multiple sources and it's more complex, but you want to simplify this by using what you know. In Unit 2, method is very important. So your method is likely to fall under one of these categories that we've talked about: a comparative essay, a historicist essay, a lens essay, or a test of theory essay. And I think it's important for you to be kind of clear in your mind and also clear in your essay itself about your method, about why your method is needed. How does your method reveal to us something about your text that we wouldn't recognize if we just did a traditional single source analysis? That's why we need to do a multi-source analysis, because doing a multi-source analysis will give us a better, different understanding of the situation. So your essay, your introduction will probably have a method statement that describes how you're approaching the text involved in this essay. And this statement could come in any number of ways. It could come directly after your text statement, perhaps on the way to a discussion of your terms. So for example, reading Shakespeare's play after watching Longcrane's film allows us to see how Shakespeare himself used comedy in his own tragical history. Or it could come directly after your thesis statement as a gesture toward what's at stake. By looking at Shakespeare's Earl of Richmond in light of Longcrane's, we can come to a new appreciation of Shakespeare's attitude toward monarchy, as I discussed in the conclusion of this paper. So, as always, there's not a kind of cookie-cutter way to do a method statement, but you do want to make explicit in your introduction, in one way or another, how it is you're approaching your text, how you're putting your text into conversation with each other, and why that method is needed, why we need to approach things in that way. Your thesis, with the added complexity of a multi-source essay, the need for clarity in a thesis is even greater. So boil your thesis statement down to a simple, clean proposition. We worked a lot on Unit 1 about this, that uses big concepts to make a big claim, and then follow up that clear and concise statement with another sentence that unpacks the specifics behind that idea. So that's the kind of truth claim, explanation, structure. With respect to the structure of the entire essay, really think carefully about the structure of the body of your paper and be aware that jumping back and forth between texts in a single paragraph is usually disorienting for a reader, as is jumping back and forth between two texts from paragraph to paragraph. So you want to avoid that seesaw organization that keeps on jumping back and forth, and instead structure the body of your essay according to the fields of evidence. Deal with one field of evidence in full and then move on to the next field of evidence. So, for example, you could make your body about the main text that you're working with, and your comparative text you could cover in the terms section of your introduction, referring back to that comparative text as you're doing the analysis of the main text in the body. Or you could deal with all of your Shakespearean evidence in one body section, which might involve multiple paragraphs, and then move on to deal with the Heath in a second body section. In your analyses, in your later analyses, you can refer back to those earlier analyses and you can remind your reader about what's going on. Your evidence, we use more orientation in a multi-source essay than in a single source essay. The places to include orientation are sometimes contingent on your audience. So if you're writing to psychologists, you really need to explain more to them about Shakespeare's Macbeth and what's happening in Shakespeare's Macbeth than you do if you're writing to Shakespeare scholars. Conversely, if you're writing to Shakespeare scholars, you don't really need to tell them what happens in Macbeth. They already know what happens in Macbeth. So you have to understand who your audience is in order to understand how you should approach your orientation. You do want to use the Harvard Guide to Using Sources, not only to help you format your paper in proper MLA style, but also to help you integrate evidence effectively. So see especially the summarizing, paraphrasing, quoting sections and the nuts and bolts section. This effective integration of evidence is especially important in light of contextual sources, those reference works that we're working with. They should usually not be quoted. They should instead be summarized and paraphrased. Save your quotes for the literary text that you're dealing with. For historical evidence, consult those Oxford reference sources. And once you've settled on your topic, your question, problem, and argument, go back and reread your text. And what you'll notice is with your increased focus, you'll notice evidence that you didn't notice before. Finally, just take a second to think about the assignment that you're being asked to do. Most of the things you're being asked to do in this essay are skills that we developed in Unit 1. You know how to develop a question or problem, set up terms, deliver a thesis, cover evidence with analysis, develop an argument, respond to counters, and deliver stakes and implications. So there's really 3 new things that we're doing in this essay. You're drawing evidence from multiple sources, you're employing a more sophisticated methodology, and you're using reference works for reliable context. Note those points of emphasis in the assignment itself. What I'm especially going to be concerned with is method, structure, and implications. You all already know how to do the evidence analysis argument moves, so these are the more sophisticated moves that we're going to be focused on in this assignment, but that doesn't mean that you can leave behind evidence analysis and argument. That's the basic building block of any essay. Before you start writing, review my comments on your Essay 1 draft and revision, because I do the same when I grade. I go back and look at those areas of focus that we've talked about in previous papers. And what I like to say is that Draft 2 is basically our midterm, because we don't have a midterm test in our essay. Unit 1 was, we took things pretty slow, we developed our skills, we were practicing. Unit 2 is, can you execute those skills that we spent time developing in Unit 1, in addition to the 3 skills just talked about that we're developing here in Unit 2. So the challenge is there are more texts that you're dealing with, there's less time that we're spending with the text for you to think about them. So your answer is you have knowledge that your reader needs and you have confidence. So use the strategies we've been talking about in our course, use the strategies we've talked about in today's video class, and lead your reader through a multi-source discussion where you identify how bringing in some additional sources helps you deliver a better argument than you could were this a single source analysis. Okay, gang, listen, I hope everyone had a fantastic time with Housing Day. I hope your celebrations were fun, safe, and fulfilling, and that your spring break is a relaxing, restful, or the opposite if that's what you're looking for. We will reconvene on the Tuesday after spring break. That will be a conference week for us. So you'll submit your draft for the second unit the Sunday at the beginning of spring break. You'll take a little bit of time off. You'll get comments back from me at the start of the week following spring break, and we'll set up a conference, we'll set up a workshop in class, and then we'll go forth from there. Okay? Everyone, have a nice break.